Good afternoon. Welcome to our third lecture in this year's Cosmos and Creation Conference. In the previous two lectures, Bob Ulanovitz successfully dismantled the common notion of deterministic reductionist science and showed its chasms, its gaps, and showed other windows. And in this context, he repeatedly mentioned Carl Sagan, and maybe you don't know that, or not everybody knows it. This conference, Cosmos and Creation, owes its name to Carl Sagan's famous book, Cosmos, which came out in the 1970s, in which he propagated that notion that science is all there is, and there is nothing to say about God. And so Father Solomon and Tom King, when they founded Cosmos and Creation Conference, they called it Cosmos and Creation in order to show that there's actually more to Cosmos than just that, and that there is wiggle room for creation within the cosmos. Another popular religion-bashing tool is Darwin. And so we are very happy that today we have Daryl Domning to speak to us about Darwin and theology. Daryl Domning, among others, is an ardent fan of Pierre de Chardin, who also was mentioned several times today. I can tell you the story that in some Jesuit seminary library, there was an order that Thea's books should not be on the shelf. So they stacked them on the floor. Daryl Domning is a paleontologist and also an anatomist at Howard University, not far from here. And he also served as an advisor for the Science for Seminaries program within the school. And he is, of course, a regular contributor and member of Cosmos and Creation. So we are very much looking forward to his presentation on Darwin and theology. Please welcome Daryl Domning.
Thank you, Rich. It's a pleasure to be addressing this group, as always. Okay. Well, we live in exciting times for theology, and many old ideas are being rethought, and many new ones are being floated. And one very fruitful source of new insights is the natural sciences, not least among which is evolutionary biology. I'm not the only biologist who thinks so. For example, David Sloan Wilson made this comment regarding current ways of thinking in the social sciences in general, which of course include theology. Quote, "I will venture the following prediction. Take any subject that is relevant to human behavior and study it in the way that a behavioral ecologist or an evolutionary game theorist would study the subject in non-human species, and that approach will be largely new from the standpoint of the human social sciences." End quote. So thus are we encouraged to explore new horizons, even in theology. After all, evolution is a major fact of life in the broadest sense, so theology could hardly get away with ignoring it. But my message for you today is that it's not just any version of evolution that's most fruitful for this exploration, but specifically Darwinian or neo-Darwinian theory. You will find that I am an unrepentant and unapologetic neo-Darwinian. We'll see what that means, maybe. But I want to touch briefly on several examples of how Darwinian thinking or a Darwinian mindset can give insights into diverse issues in theology and Scripture. Now, you all know Mr. Darwin here, and many of you are probably aware that he's gotten some good press in recent years among Catholic and other theologians. For example, the Georgetown University theologian John Haught, who was mentioned this morning, has often referred to our modern understanding of evolution as Darwin's great gift to theology. And I would certainly agree. But it's important to remember that the simple idea of evolution was not original with Darwin. Darwin's unique contribution was the idea of natural selection. There it is right in the title. That was and remains the key explanation of how organisms become adapted to their environments, and how that, the fact of adaptation, comes about has always been the big issue. It was Darwin's proposal of selection as a plausible mechanism of adaptive evolution that tipped the balance of scientific opinion in favor of evolution itself. But I don't want to leave the impression that the fact of evolution by itself doesn't get us very far in theology. It certainly does. For example, assuming there is a God, it constrains the kind of creator and creation that we have to imagine. This is a good example of what Pope John Paul meant, as Bob Jelanovich said, quoting him last night, about science giving religion a better grasp of reality. If creation began with a single event in time, and if today's living things came about through evolution and not a series of special creations, that implies a single creator. And since all that happened a long time ago, the creator must have lots of patience. And waiting that long for natural processes to do their thing shows that the creator respects the autonomy of those processes, including chance, and respects the things that they produce, such as us. God is not a micromanager or a puppeteer. Those points right there rule out an awful lot of the theology that's been done in the past. More specifically pertaining to us, evolution implies that we and the rest of creation form one community that is valuable to God, apart from us, and demands our protection. There's also the continuity evolution implies between so-called lower animals and us, particularly in regard to our mental operations and our behavior. And this continuity is confirmed by the observations of neuroscientists and ethologists. And then that characteristically Darwinian concern with mechanism, that process of mutation and natural selection, implies, among other things, that in continuity with all our ancestors, we too will seek to survive and reproduce, and in general put our own selfish needs before those of others. But this angle hasn't always been obvious. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this gentleman too, Father Pierre de Chardin, S.J., who can reasonably be considered the father of evolutionary theology. He's had a profound influence on Christian thought in the 20th and now 21st centuries by bringing into it the idea of organic and indeed cosmic evolution in place of the static, literal reading of the biblical creation stories that had hobbled our thought for centuries. And not just reconciling our theology with the uncomfortable idea of evolution, but using evolution as a positive source for theology that could actually improve our comprehension of revelation and of God's action in the world. So Teilhard certainly built on Darwin, but the ironic thing was that he did so somewhat indirectly. What I mean is that Teilhard started with the simple fact of evolution, what Darwin called descent with modification, and went on from there, mainly theologizing in an eschatological direction about the grand sweep of evolution on Earth toward the final goal that he called the omega point. But natural selection played no discernible part in Teilhard's thinking. There's nothing particularly Darwinian about Teilhard's evolutionary theology. And I think this put Teilhard at a serious disadvantage when he got called on the carpet by his religious superiors. The particular objection that the Roman inquisitors raised was that Teilhard didn't seem to have an adequate explanation for evil and sin. He clearly discarded the story of the literal Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, and that seemed to do away with the doctrine of original sin, and with it the church's whole theory of how Christ provides for our salvation. But when Teilhard tried to account for salvation by Christ within his own very optimistic concept of evolution toward the omega point, he wasn't very convincing. He simply didn't have a clear, concrete idea of where evil and sin came from and what role they might play in the evolution story. Why was this? Well, notice his dates. Born 1881, died 1955. And he was, of course, French. That means he got his scientific training in France just after the turn of the 20th century, when Gregor Mendel's discoveries in genetics had just themselves been rediscovered, and at a time when Darwin's view of the importance of natural selection had reached a low ebb of acceptance among scientists. It wasn't until the 1930s and 40s that genetics had been fully digested by biology and put together with many other lines of evidence to form what we call the neo-Darwinian synthesis, in which selection has regained its rightful prominence and which remains our dominant paradigm in biology today. Please note that in its original and accurate meaning, neo-Darwinian refers to the combination of Darwin's natural selection with Mendel's genetics. Some people who self-identify as neo-Darwinians today add quite a bit of ideology and other arguments to that, which may produce the illusion that neo-Darwinism is something that it wasn't originally defined as back in the 30s and 40s. We might want to call that neo-Darwinism something, but anyway. Anyway, by the 30s and 40s, Teilhard's theological vision had already crystallized, and it reflected French biology in general, which inclined toward French evolutionary ideas like neo-Lamarckism and the vitalistic philosophy of Henri Bergson, but had little use for British notions like Darwin's natural selection. So as a result, Teilhard missed what we now see as the most essential and most Darwinian aspect of evolutionary biology. George Gaylord Simpson, himself one of the architects of the neo-Darwinian synthesis and a friend of Teilhard's, wrote that, quote, Teilhard never grasped the concept of natural selection, end quote. This is where I think Teilhard blew it. As I've written and spoken about at length, it's the self-centered behavior that natural selection necessarily enforces on all living things that accounts naturally and elegantly for our congenital inclination to sin, and which has received the name original sin, or as I prefer to call it, original selfishness. This moral evil has literally evolved out of the more general phenomenon of physical evil, meaning physical mishaps of every sort. Basically anything we don't like is called physical evil that happens to us. This includes genetic mutations, which are usually harmful, but also provide the raw material for evolution itself. So we have here a general solution to the philosophical problem of evil. And this downside of evolution by natural selection cannot be separated from its upside, which is the creative process of evolution itself that has produced us and the rest of God's very good world of living things. It's this necessary linkage between the bad and the good in evolution that does away with the whole issue of theodicy and the problem of evil. God could not have created a material universe in any other way. But to fulfill God's ultimate plan, now that we're here, we are called on to turn away from the law of natural selection or survival of the fittest and act selflessly and altruistically. We can count this resolution of the problems of evil and original sin as a prime example of Darwinian contributions to theology. This point about selection enforcing self-centered behavior, of course, emphasizes the role of competition in evolution, which was central to Darwin's thinking. Again, right there in the title, The Struggle for Life, competition. However, this takes us into another controversy of sorts, because cooperation among organisms is also a prominent feature of evolution. So the question arises, which phenomenon is more fundamental or causally prior? And this question is of theological interest, because a lot of people feel that cooperation is good, but competition and selfishness are bad. So if evolution depends on competition, but we're commanded instead to behave cooperatively and altruistically, there must be something evil about evolution. Now, in 2006, I argued that, quote, the origins of cooperation and apparent altruism seem explainable in terms of selfishness, and selfishness may have been accompanied and facilitated by cooperation right from the beginning. But no one has managed, or so far as I know, even tried to explain the origins of selfishness itself in terms of altruism. Selfishness would thus appear to be the more primitive and fundamental condition, with altruism, if it arises at all, as its later appearing derivative. End quote. However, a few years later, Bob Ulanovitz did just what I had never observed when he wrote this. Quote, that competition derives from mutuality and not vice versa represents an important inversion in the ontology of actions, end quote. In other words, exactly the opposite of my assertion. Well, Bob and I went back and forth about this over a couple of years, and we finally agreed that this is really a chicken and egg situation. The solution lies in, as Bob mentioned in passing in his talks, the solution lies in distinguishing different levels of organization. Ulanovitz is right that competition derives from mutuality, but from mutuality at a lower level. Within any given level of organization, competition is causally prior and can bring forth cooperation, which then in turn can spark competition at a third, still higher level. Cooperation emerges secondarily at each level as an effective strategy for competing. For example, prokaryotic bacterial cells, and we have 3 different kinds, they might unite symbiotically to form a eukaryotic organism on the cellular level. Such eukaryotic cells, and this is a form of union and cooperation, such eukaryotic cells might then compete as separate organisms until some of them combine to form a multicellular organism here on the organismic level. A multicellular organism of which the eukaryotes are just the constituent cells. Multicellular organisms might then compete among themselves, going up above the screen, and eventually combine to form a society or superorganism such as an ant colony, within which competition is suppressed in order to facilitate competition with other colonies, and so on. Another example, a group of people form a cooperative tribe, which competes with a neighboring tribe. Then those 2 tribes form an alliance to fight the tribe across the river, and so on up the scale. Depending on where in the hierarchy of levels of organization we look, we might find that either cooperation or competition is primary, either is derivative. Which one is ultimately ontologically primary seems to be a question not for biology, but for chemistry at least, and probably for particle physics, if not metaphysics, because both cooperation and competition were arguably present, you heard it argued today, present long before the origin of life. And that's another story, of course, and Bob touched on that in his talks. But among living things, both cooperation and competition are adaptive strategies promoted by natural selection. Both are part of God's very good creation. And both play roles in the process of evolution itself by which we all got here. So that's the take-home message for theology. One take-home message. There are more coming. Speaking of that biblical story of creation, recall that in the case of the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3, natural selection has since been the key to an objectively new understanding of original sin. But Mr. Darwin, Mr. Darwin can also help us in other ways in interpreting the Bible. Later in Genesis, in chapter 22, we find a dramatic example of how a Darwinian style of thinking, even when it doesn't add to Scripture anything really new, it can at least cut through a lot of confusion and get to the essentials of the scriptural message. At least it did that for me. The story is the binding or sacrifice of Isaac, known in Hebrew as the Akedah. The background, of course, as you know, is that God made a covenant with Abraham, whose wife Sarah was barren, that Abraham would father a great nation and be given a land to dwell in, provided that he and his progeny remained faithful to God. Eventually, Sarah gave birth to Isaac, as God had promised, but then God asked Abraham to sacrifice that very child's life. Abraham was in the act of doing so when God's angel stopped him, and he instead sacrificed a ram in Isaac's place. And the reaction of commentators ever since has been, what the heck was that all about? Really? It's maybe the most scandalous passage in all of Scripture, and has spawned endless speculation and crises of faith for believers in the Abrahamic traditions. What kind of heartless God would make such a request? What kind of father would agree to it? Should he have loved his son more than he loved God? The answers proposed have been all over the map. The story justified a ban on child sacrifice. Or it was just a horrible example of family dynamics, like a Jewish version of the Oedipus story. Or maybe Abraham had to atone for how he had treated his other son, Ishmael, and Ishmael's mother, Hagar. Or the story symbolizes the binding of every Jewish child to the fate of the Jewish people. Or Isaac not only agreed to his own slaughter, but even bound himself. Or he really was slain, but then resurrected. Or maybe Abraham was really putting God's morality to the test, God's morality, by agreeing. Or maybe he had misunderstood and God had really just wanted him to bring Isaac up the mountain and not kill him. And of course, we also have to consider how Isaac and Sarah felt about all this. Well, after reading all these interpretations and more besides, I came to the conclusion that the point was being missed. Maybe in some cases because it was too uncomfortable to face. Because when I went back to the lead-up to this incident, as Genesis describes it, being the evolutionary biologist that I am, the logic of the whole story made perfect sense to me. And not only that, but it seemed perfectly in line with the Bible's whole account of the covenant in salvation history. And what scandalized me was the fact that although the story was a pivotal point of the whole Bible, its message has been effectively neutralized by the simple fact that no one can agree on what it means. So it's basically been bracketed off and set aside. But if instead you approach the story of the Akedah with Darwinian assumptions about human biology and human nature, this is how it looks. It's strictly about the two protagonists, God and Abraham, and them alone. Abraham, like any living creature subject to natural selection, sought to have offspring. But he couldn't, at least not by his wife. This gave God an opening. God is portrayed in the Bible as having a grand plan for the human race that was going to require human cooperation. So God chose this fellow Abraham, who was a man of integrity, who seemed like he could be trusted to keep a bargain, and offered him a straightforward deal. Abraham, I'll not only give you a son, I'll give you more descendants than you can imagine, plus the land and resources they'll need to support themselves, and I'll protect them from now on. In return, you and your descendants have to remain loyal to me and carry out my plan, specifically by doing what is right and just. But if they break this covenant, the deal's off, and they will lose the land and my protection. Well, Abraham agrees, and eventually Isaac is born, which is a sign that God intends to keep his side of the bargain. But it's only fair that Abraham should show his good faith too. And the test that God puts him to is a very telling but logical one, because this God is a jealous God who intends that nothing in the world or in the human heart should come before God's self. Certainly not any of God's own gifts to humankind. So the question to be answered was, which did Abraham value more? His own Darwinian fitness, as we call it, meaning his hope of posterity, or God's will? In other words, fidelity to the one who made the promise, or idolatry of the promise itself? Here again, that challenge to turn away from the way of nature, the way of the world, and act contrary to one's own selfish interests. As the story goes, Abraham passed the test, and once again God proved trustworthy by not requiring Isaac's life after all. The people of Israel lived ever after, though not always happily, because God's promise of the land was conditioned on their remaining as loyal to God as Abraham had been. So for centuries thereafter, their chronicles recorded, reverse after reverse, and exile after exile, whenever they abandoned the way of the Lord. To this Darwinian, anyway, this is how the Akedah looks. Not mysterious or ethically paradoxical, just a clear, simple bargain. Hard but fair, but definitely counter-evolutionary, and the basis for the whole rest of the biblical story of Israel. Indeed, the rest of salvation history. Parenthetically, it also provides the theological background of the story of modern Israel and the Zionist movement that reclaimed the land of Palestine in the 20th century. The catch here, and the real ethical paradox, is that modern political Zionism began in the 1890s as a secular movement among mostly non-religious, even atheistic European Jews who nonetheless made free use of the biblically based claim to the Promised Land to justify their policies toward the Palestinians. From the 1890s onward, however, many religious Jews have been very vocal in pointing out the contradiction here. As the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé neatly expressed the paradox, the secular founders of Zionism did not believe in God, but he nonetheless promised them Palestine. That promise, of course, still has a string attached about doing what is right and just. In binding Isaac, Abraham bound the nation of Israel to a God of justice. So it can justifiably be asked, will today's Israel honor that counter-evolutionary commitment? You see, these ideas we're tossing around have more than just academic implications. Now, as long as we started talking about moral theology, we can note in passing that some biologists, as Bob pointed out, have called into question the reality of morality's whole basis, namely free will. The name most often mentioned in this connection is Benjamin Libet, a physiologist whose experiments back in the 1980s seemed to show that decisions we make are first made by our subconscious. Let's see, here. First made by a subconscious here on the graph, prior to our becoming consciously aware of them here, and thinking we consciously made them. Pressing a button here after we've given signs of having decided to do so somewhere before we became consciously aware of deciding to do so. Libet himself didn't draw this conclusion, but many others have inferred that the reasons for our choices are quite possibly other than we think them to be and out of our control. So our freedom of choice is an illusion. We just rationalize what we've done after some random interactions of chemicals in our brains, which relieves us of moral responsibility. So we see here. Okay. Well, this is a very complex subject, and these and similar experiments have been criticized in every possible way. For one thing, how free will itself should be defined is not as simple as it looks. How exactly, for example, must the will be free? What exactly must the will be free from in order for us to have free will? There's a large philosophical literature on this subject, and that's before we even get to the layers of complexity in the experimental methodology. I think the jury is still very much out on how to interpret experiments of this sort. But one thing a Darwinian can say about such studies of behavior is that natural selection has the last word. Many times we have to make split-second decisions with life or death consequences, like when facing a predator or driving on the Beltway. Whatever data or mental processes we use have to be tightly bound to the real world, and in that sense are trustworthy, at least in general. So we should not be bothered by evidence that our brains might be analyzing a situation even before we are conscious of it, and biasing our conscious decisions toward a particular course of action. The chances are good that it will be an adaptive course of action. It's like an efficient staff generating a recommendation for the chief executive, who then makes the decision. She trusts and relies on her staff, even though she may sometimes overrule them. And the longer we have to ponder a decision, the more chance there is to weigh the moral pros and cons along with the pragmatic ones, and for our decision to be not only rational, but truly free. Still, some evolutionary biologists insist that natural selection has molded us to behave in certain ways, altruistically, for instance, while remaining unconscious that our true motives are evolutionarily selfish ones. Our mental processes may very well include all sorts of mechanisms for self-deception aimed at getting us to behave in adaptive ways. It's our behavior that counts, after all, not whether we understand it. Therefore, they say, the objectivity of our thoughts is highly suspect at best, above all in matters of religious belief, which can often be shown to serve the selfish interests of individuals or social elites. This argument undermines belief in free will and moral responsibility as well. But I think this is jumping to too broad a conclusion. What studies really seem to show is that self-deception is adaptive only in the narrow social context of attempts to deceive others. I'm a more convincing liar, for example, if I've first convinced myself that I'm telling the truth. In general, we can access non-deceptive mental processes whenever we wish to take a truly hard, critical look at our own behavior. To the Darwinian, it's objectivity that is ultimately the most adaptive. Now, when it comes to this sort of self-examination, Mr. Darwin can even give us insights into spirituality. And since I'm giving this talk at Loyola, I also have to give credit to the Jesuits. For example, in the second week of his spiritual exercises, St. Ignatius Loyola presents the meditation on the two standards: the choice between following the way of Christ or the way of Satan. Ignatius, the former combat soldier, described this choice under the metaphor of the standards or banners to which the troops of rival leaders would rally in the confusion of battle. But if his 16th century romantic imagery of knights in battle doesn't appeal to your spiritual sensibilities, maybe something more concrete and down to earth may help. In the Gospels, we find many passages where Jesus tells us in various ways, but very plainly, that whoever wishes to be his follower must deny his very self. Now that you're reading this with a Darwinian mindset, it's obvious that he's saying that to build the kingdom, carry out that grand plan that God had in mind even back in Abraham's day, we must stop following the rule of the survival of the fittest, the way of the world. The way of the world here in John's Gospel, and follow instead the rule of altruism or Christian love. Rally to the standard of Christ, not to that of the prince of this world. This is a radical break with the old rules of the game, a genuine turning point in human evolution. And St. Paul in 2 Corinthians got it when he said, quote, "If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old order has passed away. Now all is new," end quote. Well, turning from what Paul called the new to something so much newer it hasn't even happened yet, we find that theologians have already been challenged about what they'll say if it turns out that extraterrestrials exist. Rather than spend much time on this, I'll let Jack Haught respond that it won't be a problem, because at least evolutionary theology has, quote, already enthusiastically embraced the Darwinian portrait of life, end quote. Well, I mentioned that Teilhard wasn't a full-blown Darwinian, but he accepted Darwin's descent with modification, which is close enough for this purpose. So we can be sure that if E.T. is a fellow creature of God, we'll have the same existential concerns that we do, and be no less potentially religious than we are, as Haught has said. A bigger and more timely and practical theological topic that also very much involves Mr. Darwin is the creation-evolution controversy, of course. Why is it that this is still going on generation after generation, no matter how much evidence for evolution scientists come up with? What is it that drives this argument and continues to fuel it after all this time? Well, one good place to find the answer is here at the Creation Museum, right across the river from Cincinnati and just up the road from the famous fossil locality of Big Bone Lick, Kentucky. When you walk in, one of the first displays you see tells you what the controversy is really all about. And it isn't about science. It poses these questions. And down here. Can someone help me? Why am I here? Am I alone? Why do I suffer? Is there any hope? Why do we have to die? In other words, those big existential questions that every thinking human or extraterrestrial confronts. And we can add others that are obvious, like what happens after we die? Is there a God? Why is there evil in the world? And then the challenge, do different starting points matter? It's up there. Do different starting points matter in our personal lives? Creationist answer, of course, is yes. If you start with evolution, you get answers to these questions that offer no hope whatsoever. If you read very much creationist literature, you'll find it clearly stated that this is the driving force behind creationism, the desire for answers to these questions that people can live with. And that's a perfectly reasonable desire that all of us share. Of course, the rest of that literature and the rest of this museum go on to try to persuade you that only the creationist interpretation of the scientific evidence is correct, and that the evolutionists, represented by atheists like Richard Dawkins, are wrong. But these existential questions are the crucial ones. I don't believe that the average layperson, even one who answers to the name creationist, lies awake at night pondering punctuated equilibrium, or the basis of radiometric dating, or how DNA is used to construct phylogenies. It's these sorts of questions that keep us awake. And the one big thing that the creationists and the Dawkinsians absolutely agree on is that evolution offers no hope. There's no God, there's no afterlife, there's no comfort for the suffering, so just deal with it. No wonder the creationists are upset. So we have to address these legitimate theological concerns. As long as evolutionists just pile up more scientific evidence for evolution, we'll just keep talking past each other. However, I think I see a way forward. An unknown but likely sizable number of people who belong to evangelical churches are not irrevocably wedded to literal interpretation of the Bible. They align with creationism because they've been told that's the only alternative to Dawkins-style atheistic evolutionism, which won't do anything for their existential concerns. But what if they were shown that these two views, creationism and atheism, are just the extremes of a very broad spectrum? This spectrum is routinely underestimated, at least in the mass media. Take, for instance, the questions that the Gallup poll has been using for decades. They offer only three choices: evolution guided by God, evolution with no participation by God, and young earth creationism. And as you see, the poll results have been pretty steady all along, with about half of Americans accepting some sort of evolution. And to keep the results comparable over time, the Gallup folks never change the questions, but I, for one, find these questions very unsatisfactory. Let's look at them more closely. The young earth option is pretty unambiguous, and you might think the other two are simply theistic evolution and atheistic evolution, respectively. But if I had to say which comes closest to my own view, I'd have to choose evolution not guided by God, even though I'm a theist. And that lumps me together with the atheists. So this set of options does not do justice to the full range of opinions. So let's see if we can improve on it. Well, between the first and second choices, we have to make room for all the old earth creationists with their day, age, and gap theories, and maybe some of the intelligent designers too. And then we have to distinguish evolution guided by an interventionist, micromanaging, designing God from evolution by natural laws sustained by a more hands-off God. This would be my choice. Saying God had no part at all in the process is ambiguous. Is there a deist God who starts the world going and then leaves? Or is there really no God at all? So to clarify, we should add one last choice to satisfy the atheists. And I'm sure we could divide up the spectrum even more finely if we put our minds to it. But at least this gives you a sense that people's opinions about this are all over the map. with creation and atheism way out on the edges of the map. The take-home message here is that the very wide middle of that map, all this stuff in here, is made up of theistic evolutionists in the broad sense. People who believe there is a God, at least one, and that evolution is just how God creates. Some of these folks, like the intelligent designers, will quibble over how much of today's science they accept. But for the most part, these theistic evolutionists are more or less comfortable with both science and mainline Judeo-Christian theology. That means they have found ways of satisfying their existential concerns within the context of accepting some kind of evolution. I just think, if all the people who call themselves creationists, but without necessarily thinking their faith depends non-negotiably on biblical literalism, if all of them were made consciously aware of this range of options, how many might find something here they could live with? Of course, a lot of theologians today, especially though not exclusively Catholic, go further than that, saying evolution is not just something Christians can put up with or live with, but a positive source for new developments, even Darwin's great gift to theology. And for over half a century, this has been stimulating that great flood of new thinking that we can call evolutionary theology. And to sum up, I'll just quickly outline some specs of the kind of non-interventionist theistic evolution that is widely discussed and accepted today. Number one, God created the universe, and it's still a work in progress. Number two, God allows that universe to run according to its own laws, including chance of various degrees, and thereby to be, along with God, an autonomous co-creator of new and wonderful things. God allows, even invites the universe to participate in its own creation. Number three, those laws of nature include Darwinian natural selection, which is the creative force in organic evolution, but also results in suffering, death, and the innate selfish behavior that inclines us all to sin. These bad things are inseparable from any kind of material creation imaginable. So God could not have made a material creation in which bad stuff did not happen. This is an important way in which evolutionary theology improves on what we've had before. There's no more need to agonize over the so-called problem of evil or to justify the ways of God to man, as Milton put it. Number four, like the parent of a wayward adult, God can only suffer with suffering and sinful creatures and offer help and advice or grace, but without interfering in their free choices. Next, God is passionately interested in what goes on here, but stays beyond the reach of empirical science, allowing us the space to become other than God and not just God's puppets, and therefore enabling us to be capable of deep relationship with God. By precept and example, God offers us salvation from the futile Darwinian rat race that was necessary to create us. Rather than obeying that law of survival of the fittest, we are supposed to nurture the weakest and do all that social justice requires. God does not design us in detail or coerce or otherwise manipulate us, but seeks to persuade us to do these things, always respecting our freedom and encouraging our creativity. The incarnation is God's seal of approval on the goodness of the material creation. Finally, because as St. Paul said, all creation groans for release from Darwinian futility, its and our ultimate hope lies in new heavens and a new earth. and a bodily resurrection of the whole person by God's grace following our death, not just survival of an immortal, self-subsistent soul, which no longer seems to be a useful concept. Again, all of this is just one possible version of contemporary evolutionary theology, which is very much in the Judeo-Christian mainstream. I think it does a pretty good job of covering those burning existential questions we started out with. And it conflicts in no way with the actual science of evolution, which we have to distinguish from the metaphysical inferences that Dr. Dawkins misrepresents as science. Obviously, these are faith-based statements and not derived from evolutionary biology. But like the way Bob Ulanovich explained to us that natural laws work, they operate within those boundary conditions set by science that we listed at the beginning. Now consider once more, given that roughly half of the American public accepts some form of evolution, and given that a good many of even the self-identified creationists might be willing to rethink their biblical literalism if they were shown an alternative that involved evolution, allowed them to accept modern science, and helped them resolve what philosopher Robert Pennock calls their crisis of meaning, then might this be a way of doing that? Pennock suggests that we ask creationists what they believe our purpose in life to be, and then ask why we should fear that our evolutionary origins preclude our fulfilling it. Surely nothing of value is necessarily lost by acknowledging the truth of evolution. So it might be worth a try to make them aware that there are alternatives well within the realm of theology that they might not have considered. Because after all, nothing, not even Mr. Darwin or evolution, can separate us from the love of God. On the contrary, I give Mr. Darwin a lot of credit for helping us get to an understanding of our theology that is not only consistent with today's science, but more clear and coherent within itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Hi, okay. I appreciate your talk a lot. But maybe misinterpret this, but why is it necessary that chance be outside of God's knowledge? Do you use that language? I mean, the classic thought, of course, is God is outside of time, therefore.
I wouldn't. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
I don't think the chance is outside God's knowledge. The question is, how does God come by that knowledge? Is it a priori or a posteriori? With God being outside of time, as you say, as well as outside of space, it seems to me that God can know what to us is the future, but what to God is the present, because everything is present simultaneously to God. So God can see in a way that we would have to foresee. There have been some interesting experiments done in computer science with things that are called cellular automata, which are simple computer programs that follow certain rules to create a graphic pattern on a computer screen. And some of them are not terribly interesting. Others, however, produce very complicated patterns with very relatively simple appearing rules, and you just let the computer run for a long period of time. You cannot predict what the pattern is going to be. The only way, and this is what people who have been involved in creating these cellular automata have said about it, the only way to find out what the program will produce in apparently a deterministic fashion even, is to let it run and watch it and see what happens. So again, it's within a set of rules, but the rules have consequences that we cannot foresee. I don't know if it's because there's contingency involved or what, but in any case, even if there's no contingency maybe, the rules themselves have an indeterminate outcome. And so the only way to know what the outcome will be is to watch it happen. Maybe this is the way creation is in the sight of God. You know, not that God knows it a priori, but knows it from all eternity, maybe, but by watching it happen from a vantage point outside of time. So God is just as interested to see what we're going to do with our free will, or what's going to happen by various degrees of chance in the natural world, by letting the creation play itself out autonomously without micromanaging it, but willing to accept and live with what it produces. I don't know if that's helpful, but yes, sir.
It's not clear to me how far evolution can help us understand gratuitous evil. So, we're all in a community, and I steal from you. We can say that's a function of self-interest because I'm interested in survival. But it also seems that there are different types of people that go beyond interest in survival. So, like our ability to delight in the suffering of others seems like a people that can't be really explained in evolutionary terms. Is that right?
If we were to convert this to a mathematical equation about evolutionary selfishness producing various forms of evil, there would not be in that equation a factor that sets an upper limit to the result. I don't think there's a limit to the amount of harm that can be generated by unrestrained selfishness, which can, I think, this is my opinion of it, following it long enough, can warp a person's thinking, can, absolute power corrupts absolutely, as they say, and once you've been corrupted absolutely, the sky's the limit. There's no built-in limit to what a truly sociopathic person or psychopathic person might be able to imagine as something amusing to watch. We have a long history of blood sports of various sorts involving animals or even involving humans that people find entertaining. People enjoy watching displays of people beating up on each other, maybe to the death, maybe not, but you can, and it's obvious that people pay money to watch these things in various sports that I could name. Where's the limit to that? The limit is the person's imagination of what they, in their warped view of self-gratification, would like to see. So I don't see a place to draw a line or a rationalization for drawing a line anywhere to set a limit to how bad that kind of gratuitous evil can be. That's my view of it. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Taking the view which you so well articulated of the non-interventionist evolutionary theology, Chardin spoke of the omega point, but at the end he too said, but I just have to be optimistic for the Greeks out of it, because if it's non-interventionist, just like the human computer programmer was letting a thing run, if I'm going to be non-interventionist, I'm not going to think of is there a board button, oh, this one's not going to turn out, it's time to stop. And if the omega point doesn't get reached, it all flies apart. What happens to the non-interventionist God? I know that's a big question.
Well, empirically, we know that it's generally, as far as we can tell, it's generally not God's policy to pull our chestnuts out of the fire. Look at the Holocaust or any other example of genocide or some other atrocity you may choose. The famous story, apparently factual, of the prisoners at Auschwitz who put God on trial. Sitting there in the Auschwitz barracks, they held a trial of God and had advocates for the prosecution and the defense, and finally the tribunal found God guilty of allowing the Holocaust to happen. And then they adjourned to prayer. So in the end, you got to have faith, and sure, the omega point is an object of faith. As far as pushing abort buttons, it's in our power to do that. I mean, one could argue, as Allied leaders in the Second World War did argue, that the way they pushed the abort button on the Holocaust was to invade Europe and conquer the Nazi regime. And they didn't see a quicker, more elegant way of doing it. And that's been debated ever since, whether they could have done more or done something differently. But we have, and have often used, abort buttons to put a stop to this or that effort that we thought was turning into a dead end. The end of the Nazi Empire, the end of the Soviet Empire, and etc. But God pretty much lets us stew in our own juice as far as we know. Of course, the argument can be made that, well, God's way of ending the Holocaust was through the invasion of Normandy, etc. And we say, why doesn't God at least put a stop to the worst evil? How do we know he doesn't? You think that the things we've seen in history already are the worst that could possibly have happened? What about World War III? Whatever happened to that? We have not to date had a thermonuclear world war. Could have been worse, guys. So, and again, we don't know how God might work through this universe that Bob described for us that has all this wiggle room in it. Maybe God is willing to put a stop to certain things as long as he's sure we won't catch him doing it. But I don't know. My thinking is that pretty much he leaves it up to us. And I don't think we can count on a guarantee that God will keep us from destroying ourselves as a species or destroying our planet. We've got to keep that in mind as a possibility and push some abort buttons ourselves. Yes, sir.
I think we've got a problem here with the understanding of the word transcendent. Most of us as humans look at it as though God is standing out there and watching. And that doesn't really represent what it means to be present all the time. We've heard it. Our own teaching, God is both immanent and transcendent. And I don't think
Yeah, the imminent part is certainly important. And I keep coming back to what I have concluded is the best model for putting ourselves in the place of God, and it's the position of the parent of an adult child or an adolescent child who is getting himself or herself into all kinds of difficulty, will not listen to advice, will not avoid what to the parent may be obvious mistakes, and is going to behave as an autonomous agent, for better or for worse. And the parent accepts the fact that he or she can't do anything about this except just be there, offer advice, but if it's not taken, just be there and suffer with that child. There's no real alternative that does not destroy the child's autonomy, like having the child arrested and thrown in jail to protect him or her from him or herself. God doesn't arrest us and throw us in jail, so is left with the alternative of being with us, suffering with us. And as another, perhaps it's a cliche by now about Auschwitz, was where was God in Auschwitz? God was right there in Auschwitz too, suffering with the people who were there, but unable to do anything about it without destroying human autonomy. I don't know if you consider that a satisfactory solution or not. Yes, Lisa.
Yeah. I would like to come immediately to this last one and bind it up a little bit with this notion of egoism.
Egoism.
Yeah. I was always wondering why people don't see the paradox that they are speaking about the egoism that drives us, and then they are speaking about the egoism of the genes, which obviously is not the egoism of my organism, and treating them more or less as if they were not contradictory. And of course the solution lies in a very stupid understanding of identity as something given and not something made, as what we really experience is that, at least as humans, sentient beings, our identity is an ongoing process of identification, which makes it possible to identify with one's children. You have neither egoism nor altruism, really, but understanding of the faith, and then with pleasure you can, of course, speak not only of physical offspring, but you can speak of mental offspring, with the identification with a cause that may destroy the person, but the cause surviving over physical death will satisfy this identity of the doer and his cause, his goal. In a way, if we think about identity as identification with an amount, a considerable amount of freedom, well, I think that we solve both problems. How, at a certain point, there is no more an alternative between egoism and altruism, but both are given in a synthesis of an expanding of identity. And of course, then you can also say that God identifies with the word. He is not identical with the word as a given, but he identifies with the word and with explain how we can be transcendently good.
Mm-hmm. Well, several points there. Yes, a certain amount of egoism is healthy. I mean, it's a good thing to respect yourself, to look out for your own needs. That's normal and expected, and a good thing. It keeps us alive. The question of selfish genes, that gets us down into the mud of the argument about levels of selection in biology, whether the individual is the unit of selection, which I think is the case, or some would argue it's the gene that's selected. And whenever I try to think about that whole subject, it gives me a headache. But I have consciously not made reference to Dawkins's book on the selfish gene and so forth. That may all be true, but I think we've got also an override button. We've got a manual override on this, like I was talking about free will there, that whatever is going on in our genomes or epigenomes or anything else, it does at some point come to our consciousness, and then we have the freedom to countermand those inclinations, because these are really just inclinations. The DNA may try to make us do it, but doesn't have the last word. So I have no problem with seeing the individual as the unit of selection, and I don't lose sleep over selfish genes, as selfish as they may be. And we have to worry about selfish individuals, which is the bigger problem. Bob.
I have a certain sympathy with your description of the non-interventionist evolutionary God up to a point. And I guess that point, not easily defined, but it's the incipience of the divine-human dialogue, which I'm very big on, probably mentioned. And I don't remember whether this discontinuous thing, the creation of this divine-human conversation is in your list or not. And secondly, most of the messages that come from this tend to be apophatic in the sense of thou shalt not. Okay? And I just wonder if they're not warnings not to overstep. This whole selfishness thing tends to drive us beyond the optimum. The optimum that, for example, Pierre de Chardin taught, and get us into trouble. And whether that part of the conversation is a rewarding, don't push your ego, yourself, original selfishness too far. So I guess my question is there an intermediate step that you would recognize being non-interventionist up to a certain point, but then conversation starting the place of Yakada or maybe even earlier?
Well, of course, the Hebrew Scriptures portray centuries of conversation and interaction with God as the people of that time experienced it. Now, and then as Christians, we certainly acknowledge the incarnation as a little bit of intervention on the part of God, which I see, as I implied there, as a necessary course correction, and we don't have to limit it strictly to the Jesus event, because we find similar things being said in other religious traditions as well. But at some point we needed to hear that no, ethics should not be based entirely on Darwinian natural selection. And of course some people have tried to do that, to derive an ethical system from evolution without reference to revealed religion. And it doesn't always come out looking that bad. Julian Huxley, for example, had his take on evolutionary ethics, which was very much along the same lines as Judeo-Christian ethics, but without the same rationalization from revelation or anything. And then, of course, you've got many other systems like that that look distinctly evil from our point of view in terms of their results. So where was I going with this now? We've got a conversation going on that we perceive to be going on, at least. The atheist would say it's within our own minds, but where are the inputs to that internal mental dialogue? What has led us to turn our backs on the law of natural selection and say, well, okay, our whole existence is the product of the workings of the law of natural selection. Why quit now, you know? But somehow or other we've come to the conclusion, some of us, that okay, that was the booster rocket that got us into orbit, but now we've got to detach from that and go off to a higher plane with a different set of rules. And that's what Jesus is saying there in those quotes and in similar ones. Okay, you needed natural selection to get you to where you are, but now you're grown up and you can start realizing that there's a different direction you need to go in, a course correction.
I would put it slightly differently in the sense that I mentioned that there's a certain dynamic that actually creates the organization and a different dynamic that sustains it. And I think maybe this is the great point that we're talking about here. That, as you say, evolution created us, but humanity needs a different set of dynamics to sustain itself.
Yeah.
I
Well.
think we should give everybody a break. This was a wonderful conversation, a very interesting talk, and a also very nice third leg of our series of talk this weekend. Thanks, Daryl, for your talk. Thanks to all participants. That was a very rewarding event for me, at least.
Thank you all.
Again.